On independence, we discuss whether the candidates being selected right now to stand for the SNP in the next Holyrood elections should be putting independence front and centre, and whether branches should be ready to do that if the SNP for any reason hesitates. On the Pope, we talk about the track record of Pope Francis and ask whether being a modest, humble man who struck the right tone in many debates but didn't manage to move the dial on accepting women into formal roles within the church, and under whose watch the position on contraception has not changed, as it hasn't for practically a century, nor on accepting gay people. All of that. Should we even be speaking about it at a moment where a man's died? We speak too about that big Supreme Court judgment last week, which seems to have left as many problems in its wake as the clarification it made about the Equality Act and a woman being a biological woman. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Hi chums, and welcome to this week's Lesley Riddoch podcast. And we're 3 weeks into April. And this may seem a bizarre way to start this, but I have had this recurring dream, Lesley, that I have not taught for over 6 years now. But it was at this time of year I always used to get this awful dream that I'd forgotten a whole unit to teach my students who were sitting in the national exams, and I had to go in, and then I got this whole thing about I'd be writing on the whiteboard and nothing would go up and the students would be late. I couldn't find the classroom, and I swear to God, every April since then, including last night, I had that same recurring dream. I have forgotten to do something I really should have done. And that's a wee link in to say, I did remember to hit record this time.
Oh, right. That's going to haunt you for a while. Well, anyway, look, so you've laid the ghost of it. It's working.
Yes.
Well, it is working, isn't it?
It is working. It is
Yes.
recording. Whew. And yeah, but yes, so and all the things I should have had bad dreams about was not hitting record on Skype. I had dreams about not teaching things I haven't taught for 6 years. And as you said, Lesley, this is our penultimate time on Skype, because we will be switching to Zoom, because they're going to some Microsoft Teams, and will we be switching over to that?
And we say cheerio to them as they drift off there.
Yes.
So yes.
Adieu. But anyway, it's a lovely sunny day, and I don't know if you noticed that, we'll be talking about this later, that Donald Trump in his latest tweet or on Truth Social said, here Melania, we're going to Pope Francis's funeral and we're really looking forward to it! ! Now, I don't know about you. I mean, I have never looked forward to going to a funeral in my puff. And you were at one today, which was Willie Wilson's. And you might have to explain to people who Willie Wilson was and why it was such a significant day.
Yeah, well, Willie was very many things. It's always that way when you go to a funeral. You suddenly go, really? He had a PhD from Yale, and he was a almost professional. Well, he wasn't a professional wrestler. He was actually, but anyway, he was a very high grade wrestler who could go to Highland Games and win wrestling competitions. Apart from which, he was a scientist. He ran a small chain of chemists. I'm sure I'll forget more of the other, strings to his bow, and importantly, set up the Scottish Independence Foundation, which is the one that has given grants to thousands of small groups. And actually, well, I suppose I should ask them first, but I think they would probably want the link to their website put on here, because, as with most things like this, people at it, the other trustees, were definitely feeling, right, we need to carry on, where Willie has left off. But anyway, they gave some contribution to all the films I've made and helped with a month here, a month there to take time off to write the various books. And it's just been, that has all been so useful, basically, because all of us are trying to cram whatever activism we have into little corners of life, So Willie made a huge impact. And it was a very moving ceremony. It was actually his son and daughter did. His son did the eulogy, and his daughter kind of carried it. And I remember, because my dad died when I was really quite young, and I had to be that one, the one that has to kind of pucker up and actually hold it all together when you just you're just a sliver away from basically collapsing on it. But also there was a beautiful singer. But the thing that was just completely, I think, grabbed everyone by the throat was who sang Caledonia. I don't know if Dougie MacLean realizes now that, as well as the many ways that song has popped up, it's so fitting for anybody who's been very involved in Scottish independence. But that sort of line, and now I'm going home. Oh God. And when it's played beautifully and well, and the congregation quietly starts to sing along as well, I'm back there again now. So yeah, there was not a dry eye in the house. But anyway, so farewell, Willie, and I'm sure the Scottish Independence Foundation will want to say they're pressing on, and there's so much more to do.
Well, you were mixing with a lot of yeses and indie folk at the funeral today, Lesley, and also with your latest showing of the Denmark film. I'm just wondering, how did your latest article in the National, you talked about muzzled passion, and I'll let you say where that quote came from and how it was used. How have folk reacted to it? I mean, I noticed there have been a lot of very positive comments in the National to this in terms of the letters. But I mean, just in speaking to folks since you wrote it, how's the reaction been?
Well, it's had more reaction than almost any column I can remember, really. There was an awful lot of people got in touch with me directly through text or whatever and just said absolutely spot on. Quite surprising people, many of them. And I suppose for those who hadn't read it, and we'll put the link in, I mean, really, it sort of begins, and it's all James Robertson's fault, right? Because, again, I've spoken before about his brilliant book, The Testament of Gideon Mack. I'm now listening to it as an audiobook, and it's so incredibly thought-provoking. Like many books, there's times where you just have to stop to let something sink in. It's such an insightful moment. And one of those moments was when the eponymous Gideon, who is a minister who doesn't believe in God. Anyway, Gideon is kind of pondering a quote from Sir Walter Scott, who said, "Our passions are wild beasts. God grant us the strength to muzzle them." And Gideon goes on to reflect that he, in his life, succeeded in muzzling passions to survive, and yet in doing so, failed to really live. Now, that is worth letting that go round a wee bit there, because in a way, it's a very truthful insight into the challenge life poses to everybody. Are we ticking over, or are we going for it? And of course, everybody wants to, say that they're going for it. It's probably not feasible to. Children, jobs, constraints, life, time. But I was just applying this to the SNP as it approaches the 2026 elections. It's survived 18 years as the Scottish government, but has it really lived since the Indie Ref? Now, I'm not meaning to insult all the MSPs and staff who've poured, hours, days, weeks, months, lives into legislation, constituency surgeries, conferences, endless meetings, and so on. I'm just asking if there has been such a thorough and habitual muzzling of the SNP's passion for independence that nothing now will let it off the leash. Not even the best ever opinion poll results, which we've just had, or a moment like this in history and the world when all the old alliances are falling apart, all the historical certainties are crumbling, and, we can, I wrote this before, the opinion poll that suggests the next government at Westminster level will be a Tory reform coalition. So, when we've got, everything we thought we knew about the boat that we're worried about rocking is rocked. So there's all sorts of reasons that you might think, right, top gear, let's move through that. And my worry, simply from looking at what's happening at the SNP, nationally, is that they might do a repeat of 2017, which was a general election in which Nicola Sturgeon decided to take independence off the table, and the SNP lost a load of seats to the Tories. And I remember going around at that time, I can't remember with what, but so many branches had actually binned the leaflets that were coming from HQ because they had no mention of independence anywhere on them. And I noticed, just as I'm going around with the old film, some of the same sort of patter beginning, where branches are saying that whatever they get from HQ, they're going to be doing their own leaflets that has got independence absolutely front and centre. And having mentioned that to some people, I've also been sent some of the pitches being made by candidates for selection as SNP candidates right now. And a couple of them are actually saying that themselves. We're putting independence front, and if the branches have to sort of take their own measures on this, they will do that. Now, Farkens, as ever, that could just be I just met a particularly frisky bunch of people. Maybe this is not a generalised thing, and maybe the SNP is ready to stun everyone. I did also get an email from someone whose name would not be wise to mention, who said that they were told when they had explained that they were kind of ending their SNP membership for 20 to 30 years worth of membership because they, precisely this fear that the passion had gone out of the party. They had been told, wait for a big announcement in May. So, now we've been here before. We've waited for big announcements every year and so on. But so all of that could be true, that, there's something about to be launched. But the other part of the article was really saying to anyone who's sitting in these selection committees, and they're happening, a lot of them were happening last week, but they're just happening right now, is the kind of person being selected. Again, going round, I hear so many stories of people with innovative ideas to get around the strictures of the devolution settlement and reduce energy costs, pull back in the steel from a lot of, now closing down oil rigs. And they claim all of them are falling on deaf ears. Now, I'm sure there's some ideas are daft, and there's some people who are a nuisance. But the level of people that are being described, who are very talented young folk who are working in the sector and are trying to get some, sassy ideas through to get something that everyone can go, ha, an industrial policy. I don't think that's a coincidence. And I wonder about the kind of people who are coming forward as candidates. We need engineers. We need people with skills. We need industrial skills, because basically we have a deindustrialized country in the shape of Britain, and we have in Scotland a country that needs lots of engineering to get to where we want to be, particularly in engineering a method of getting energy so that it isn't absolutely crippling us. But really, we're never going to get to this green transition with folk who are so risk averse, as I'm afraid I think the civil service are, and as many ministers who won't stand up to them actually are. Now I don't know, this could be a wrong version of it, but I would rather be voicing some of these worries and be shot down in flames as just not knowing what on earth I'm talking about. Because I think we need people in Holyrood who either have those kind of skills or have the skill of listening to those people. And that's a skill, because at the moment it sounds like there's a lot of talking to the hand. So that was the generalized, kind of pitch. And that has got quite a few people talking, it would seem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you noticed that Alan Smith, who's seeking selection for 2026 to Holyrood, his latest quote was, I think the party needs to remember why we're here, to deliver independence. And he suggests that his local branch meets prior to the SNP National Council meeting in June, and to outline strategies for independence. And he says it's very open to all ideas, no matter how out there they are, and upping our activism. So, I mean, that's an interesting one there, because Alan Smith would have been thought as one of kind of the usual suspects for business as normal. And if he's saying that, perhaps the message is getting through to that one, to somebody like Alan. But also remember, he is standing for election, and we can recall what people say when we're trying to be elected. Yes. Tommy Shepherd again, in the National, and we refer to you directly in it, so I've no problem about raising this, seem to be suggesting that the SNP and government and support for independence seem to be rising at the same time. And he said you can't really disassociate what the SNP as a party and in government is doing for the rise in support of independence. And that took me back to a thing called post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore because of this. So there seems to be an assumption with Tommy there that because of all the things that the SNP government was doing, the support for independence was rising. He did then indicate, and I thought it was interesting in the article, he kind of hedged his bets by saying, well, of course, it might all be down to the fact of such a lousy Labour government that people are turning towards independence. One of the key things he did identify, though, which it was worthwhile discussing, I think, which is the differentiation between the number of people in terms of percentages, both at constituency and regional level, who were saying they were going to vote for pro-independence parties, which were around about 47% on both. And that was about a 10% difference between those who said they were supporting independence. And he reckoned that even though there were individuals in other parties, probably the Labour Party, who would be open to independence yet continue to vote for unionist parties, he seemed to think it was a significant element was to do with turnout. And his suggestion, and I'm trying to get my head around this one, was that they should be endorse a demand to change the Scotland Act to remove the prohibition on the Scottish Parliament acting on the Union. And I assume that's code for the Scottish Parliament, if it decided, could call a referendum. And I just thought, I mean, independence now, talking about save Grangemouth, talking about industrial strategy, versus we want you to endorse a demand to change the Scotland Act is hardly a rallying cry, I would have thought, from my perspective. But that was what it was about. It doesn't exactly trip off the tongue as a set of slogans like it's Scotland's power, it's Scotland's energy, save Scotland's industry. To me, yeah.
Well, I think the core of his article actually is that he basically, acknowledges the sort of, if you like, the sort of problem of perceived lack of passion and whatever.
Yeah.
As you say, then says that there's fewer people who would vote for all the pro-independence parties than say they would vote yes. And he says, the problem with that is not because the electorate thinks that, people like the SNP lack passion and, are not up for it. It's because they don't think it can be achieved, or they don't see how it can be achieved. Now, I mean, that's a fair point. And that's where he kind of goes in to then say this would be a way round it. As you say, it's worded just exactly as you said, which doesn't sort of quite. Now, there's a few things to me. You could spend about 100 years just trying to clarify this in your head. But as far as I understood it, and I did speak to a lawyer this morning, the problem is parliamentary sovereignty. It's not just that it kind of sits within the Scotland Act, but as I understand it, parliamentary sovereignty is like, written through the whole of British legislation like a kind of stick of rock. So that there was essentially almost no chance that you could ever allow anything which would dismantle the state and threaten parliamentary sovereignty. And by that, I mean Westminster's parliamentary sovereignty. That one was not a flyer, according to the Supreme Court. So I don't know, but I'll quite grant you that Tommy would have had time to check about this, whether just changing the Scotland Act would do the business. But still, as you say, that still is kind of like, if what I'm trying to say is people need to see a sort of passion for independence, it doesn't mean you have to be a wild child just running up and down the streets going, yelling independence. But it needs to have the appearance of really serious intent. And that doesn't actually mean more blooming papers about stuff that also tends to hedge its bets. I want to see some action. So, for example, today, an hour ago, the IMF slashed its global growth forecast because of, Donald Trump and his blasted tariffs. It seems now that ironically, the country worst hit by this is the United States. Nice one, mate. But the next, the forecast for the UK is also being cut, with the economy now expected to grow by, I think I'm sight reading this, so it looks like it's about a percent less than expected. And they point out that, the economic growth is expected to be stronger than Germany, France and Italy. And here's the point. Inflation, however, will be the highest in the world's advanced economies at 3.1% this year, largely due, and I might just have to scream, to higher bills, including for energy and water.
Yeah.
Now, here we are again. The highest bills for water, that's an English problem. That's a problem of privatisation, of sticking more, of raising the bills to try to not have unadulterated shite flowing through your rivers. And I'm not saying we're perfect, but we have a fraction of the bill and we have a fraction of the problem of that, because Scottish Water remains in public hands. And I'll quite grant you, they're having their trouble at the moment because their folk are out on strike. But nonetheless, the point is, the highest bills that now can help to contribute to the highest inflation in the world's advanced economies. One is water privatisation, which applies to England and Wales and was introduced by Margaret Thatcher, or just after her, who we did not vote for. Second, energy. Just don't even start me on how bad this is. I mean, we've talked about this before. Our energy, 50% more than Germany, twice as expensive as the United States because of a preoccupation with gas, because of thumping loads of money into nuclear, which will be the most expensive fuel energy source around. And Scotland, if we were able to separate ourselves out from this, using the kind of locational pricing which Greg Jackson from Octopus is talking about, our bills would be the lowest in Europe. Now, can somebody at the SNP scratch their heads and come up with a strategy to put that kind of thing front and centre? Because that seems to me to be precisely where politics is at. And yet I hear nobody coming out with really thought through an analysis of this. Maybe it's because, the day-to-day stuff is devolved issues, and actually energy is Westminster's bag, and water, it's a different system north and south of the border, thank God. But, this is what I expect to see. And I expect to see somebody who's using their heads to try to get a few results out of bad situations here. I have to say my, annoyance levels is probably this high because I spent the weekend in Applecross, beautiful, beautiful place, showed the Denmark film. It was very jolly. It's grand. Applecross, a peninsula away up the northwest, just about beyond Loch Carron, looking across to Rona, Rassie and Skye. That peninsula is ringed by mountains, so high indeed that the Bealach na Ba, sorry, get the Gaelic pronunciation right for the area, that Bealach is actually the highest pass in Britain. The seas on the other side of Applecross, the sound that sits between the inner sound between Applecross and Rassie, is the deepest sound around the British waters. So, there's that's the kind of geography they're sitting with. If they had hydro along half of a quarter, a tiny proportion of the places that it could be obtained there, and they were able to feed it into the grid and get some money back from it, and able to bring their own, own that and have it for their own bills, they should essentially hardly be paying anything. As it is, a survey found that 7 in 10 of the people who responded, 7 in 10 are living in fuel poverty. And the community hydro, which was set up in 2016, can only feed half of its meagre output into the grid, because the grid, and here's a technical point, folks, is shite. It's a tiny, tiny little grid that sits from the days when there was kind of, 2 guys and a dog out there, and we just needed to, send a little bit of energy out to them. And the result is that there's no space to feed stuff back in. And it's the reason that it's very hard for businesses to site on Applecross. So the Applecross distillery is not on Applecross. Now, if someone can explain in SSE how this fosters sustainable development, I'm sure we're all listening. I did inquire to them. They were quite cute and just got back to me on Thursday. It took them over a week to reply, and that was just before public holidays. So I haven't had a chance to go further with this. But they're saying that it only took them 6 years to get to the stage that they realised that the promises they'd made to the community hydro, they better do something about it. So they applied for planning to upgrade the line. They're saying the Scottish government has it sitting in their in tray. I haven't had time to check yet with the Scottish government. But all I'm saying is, we need some really just focus on 3 or 4 things and get some blooming results. Quite apart from the question of independence and what it would do for us, it would stop us having to try to keep bailing out a privatised society that doesn't see anything particularly wrong with the problem. Okay, I'll quite grant you that when the public are asked about it, even in England, they're now at the stage that they just want to go back to the way we were. But I think their politics makes that extremely unlikely to happen. But on the energy front, just that, that should be front and centre of an election campaign. Even if it's the Scottish Parliament elections, we just need to play the strongest bat we've got. And I think, given where we are, that we've just had that said, that we're going to have the highest inflation in the world's advanced economies because of energy, which is controlled by Westminster. Come on.
Yeah, but it does take us back to something you said within the article that sprang out at me, particularly the events of the last week. You said that the past 10 years, there's been a focus on social policy and identity. And that's one of the things, it kind of leads quite naturally, and you mentioned the Supreme Court there, it leads quite naturally into the decision that was taken by the Supreme Court in terms of the definition of a woman to be based upon biology. Yeah, and that's what's come out. And I was thinking about it, Lesley. If we all thought that the Supreme Court decision that biological sex rather than gender would be the defining feature of what is a woman, would going to be settle the matter? Gosh, it certainly hasn't, given the events of the past few days and the reaction that there has been to that decision. And I know you're going on debate night to talk about it, so. Here we go. We have to delve into it, but just on a personal basis. I come from a background which, again, I hate the use of the word progressive. I'm very liberal in my perspectives on these matters in terms of the individual's right to be the kind of person that they want to be and to respect individual decisions and respect the dignity of every single human being. Whatever their sexuality, whatever their ethnicity, whatever the religious or lack of religious beliefs are. And that's the direction I come from. So I'm kind of on the fence here to a certain extent, where I think in a grown-up society, we ought to be able to have a discussion and rational discussion that doesn't go into hyperbole and overblown statements and anger about matters, that actually respects the rights of individuals who are trans equally with the rights of women. And the lived experience of both sets of folk should be taken as for granted. You cannot deny the rights of one to give rights to another. And that's the way I feel about it. We can go in more in depth about it, but that's just the general position I come from. And I've moved to and from on this and reached certain conclusions about the fact that single sex spaces and the rights of women in terms of sport and the rights of women in terms to be represented, biological women that is, to be represented on public bodies is paramount to me. And that's my feeling about it, whilst not being, in my perspective, any way, shape or form, a transphobe. Yet I'm quite absolutely certain that having made those statements, folk on the opposition side will declare me to be transphobic, because I believe that women's rights in terms of these spaces and their sitting on these bodies should be respected.
Yes. It's such a difficult one, this, because I find myself equally split on this. The way that some women have been sacked from their jobs for simply saying that, women have certain biological features is crazy. On the other hand, the idea that the biggest challenge in life to most women is the presence of trans women in changing rooms or toilets, when actually the biggest fear, I've had a lot of conversations this weekend with some younger women. I was lucky enough to spend time with some friends who had 5, quite a lot of their daughters were there and their daughters had pals. So there's about 5 of them aged between 17 and 24, and they are uniformly outraged by this. Their views are completely different generationally from, anybody older. They all know trans people of their age group, but more generally, it's such a to them, so much is quite fluid, really. The idea of identity is quite fluid. Now, some of our older generation, we might find that sometimes a bit alarming, actually. But nonetheless, that's the way it is. And they feel very, very angry on behalf of friends, the same way we all felt on behalf of gay friends back in the day. Mm-hmm. And if we're making law, now it might just be we're making law for largely this electorate, and this electorate, because the ones who turn out and vote are older folk, they're not ready for the level of change that would be expected if you were to say that trans women have got the same rights to be everywhere as biological women, if you want. But by gum, the next generation have got completely different views on this. And we're now in the situation where what has been passed has got some, unintended but pretty major consequences, such as, and forgive me if I haven't got the right language in this, because I think actually the language is quite a big part of this as well. Because, for example, if I was being completely woke about this, I would have my name and I would put my pronouns down. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't want to do that, right? I mean, I haven't changed my name when I'm married. I haven't put doctor when I've got a PhD. I my name's just my blinking name, and I don't want to have to change that. You would put pronouns out of solidarity with people who believe that your gender is optional and that you've chosen how you want to portray yourself to the world. And I can see that people who have got friends and who really back that position would see that even if they are biological women who just want to be seen as women, it's still polite in a way to put she, her, or whatever. But see, that to me is the difficulty, is because for a 0.45% of the population, to pick the statistic up from Maggie Chapman's article, is then making essentially everybody else who thinks this is a bit of a done deal and it's not a biggie have to kind of clarify themselves in ways that seem to me to be quite unnecessary for most of us. So there you are, there's me caught again. And there's a contradiction there, because on the other hand, it does seem it's using that small percentage. That's the small percentage of trans people that are around. They're asking, what is the big threat? So in a way, it's either a very small minority of people who are really not a big threat, and that would be my general feeling. If that's the case, I'm not sure that 0.45% needs to affect everybody else's use of language and behaviours and so on. And maybe that's where the difficulty lies. I think we were all, when it came up, and people I know will find it offensive in all sorts of ways to make parallels with the situation regarding gay people. But, the kind of appalling treatment of them was something most people were kind of aware about, because we all knew gay people, I think, if I'm right in saying. Yeah. And also, people had gay children and were then quite, were able to see the kind of world that they were being forced into. Now, of course, someone will say it's exactly the same for trans people. And I'm sure that's true. So this is the difficulty for everybody. You're sitting in the middle of this. Why would you want to make life more difficult for anyone if it's possible to just let everybody be? And I see quite a few people, this might sound ridiculous, but saying our way to deal with this, if we're getting down to the changing rooms and toilets and all this sort of lark, is to have basically unisex or gender neutral loos, which are individual cubicles. If you want to look at this in any more detail, there's quite a number of schools around Scotland that have already moved to that. Nothing to do, actually, at that point with trans issues. It's to do with bullying that goes on in loos in schools, and that lots of kids feel very sort of put upon. So it looks like we're going to have to get to a stage where it'll take time to change the estate, as it were, of schools in various places. The BBC has had unisex loos in Pacific Quay since it was built 20 years ago, whatever. That may be one solution that lets people just come and go as they are, but you keep coming back to the law. And if somebody wants to sort of make this the front of house question, then there's been a verdict on that which simply says what the Equality Act believes. And the Equality Act was modelled on the Sex Discrimination Act of 1974, and it was set up in a period where it was absolutely looking at biological women. So as far as I can see from, again, speaking to lawyers, there was not much surprise there that in terms of just interpreting the Equality Act, it would come down with the argument that women are, women are biological women. But anyway, we could now have a situation where let me get this right, a trans man, that's a person who was born a biological woman, who has transitioned into being a quite muscular man. And there's a lot less talk about this, but
yes,
if you see some pictures of trans men, they're pretty well shaped. I mean, the very muscular looking men. Those guys theoretically should now be coming into women's changing rooms.
Well, theoretically, Lesley, but I mean, I've been around this for a long time. If a trans man walked into a toilet, they would go and use the cubicle. Nobody would know any different. I'm just saying on a personal basis, because of my prostate, I use cubicles all the time. I go in and use a cubicle. I don't use a urinal. I would not pay the slightest bit of attention to some guy coming in and just going to use a cubicle. Similarly, if someone came into a changing room in a sporting area or something like that, I was a trans man, I don't look at other guys getting changed in particular. I mean, sorry about that. I don't pay any attention towards it. It's the fact is, and again, Mary Black talked about this, is that when she actually said that the talk about trans men is never comes into it, because she said it was the presumption was that because these were originally women were weak and incapable of violence. Therefore, to actually talk about this revealed your misogyny, because the presumption that trans men weren't a threat to anybody because they were essentially women who were weak. And I'm thinking to myself, I've just gone into a whole world there that I cannot get my head around in terms of gender stereotyping there, and the presumption that trans men are incapable of violence, saying that they're not a threat, it somehow makes me transphobic and misogynist. And I really feel I'm trying to get to grips with that. I really can't understand it.
I think that is a complexity too far. I mean, I really think that the issue is single-sex spaces where, okay, men can have single-sex spaces. I think they're called burn suppers in many parts of Scotland. But anyway, yes. But, the single-sex space argument for women was simply to have a bit of safety where you could just, let your guard down and just do your own thing as women. But I suppose, more than that, what underlies most of this is a fear of male violence.
Yes.
This is what it is, right? So that fear of male violence is very strong and borne out by quite a lot of what happens in the world. I would think seriously, the least of which is a trans woman coming into a changing room.
Yeah.
However, that's the one that's closest, and it's the one that caught attention on what should have originally just been a bit of housekeeping to make a bit of some of the law about women's representation on public boards compliant. And actually, too, it was put before the Court of Session in Scotland twice and okayed. It was supported by Labour, no matter how much they're trying to duck now. So when this started off, it didn't have quite the level of sort of anger attached to it. I'll quite give you, because I know people who are very, very much at the centre of this. And once you personally have been hounded over it, or you've got a friend who's hounded over it, it then becomes a much, much different sort of, proposition. And I'd also quite say that, having a friend like Auntie Whiteman, who was pretty much hounded out of the Greens, I think because at one point he called a person with a beard wearing trousers, and there was some outrage because he'd misgendered him. It's kind of, you'd need to be pretty psychic or just constantly be policing your language in ways that people would probably find unusual to not fall into what look like these traps. It also isn't helpful, I think, that the Greens have got a position that they won't share a platform with anyone who doesn't agree with their outlook on gender recognition. I mean, you could get to a stage that you wouldn't share a platform with somebody who supports Trident. There's plenty of big, meaty policies in life that you might think are such totemic policies that you actually can't share platforms. And we've got a situation now, if we're going to get going on independence, we have to, I think, start to question that sort of approach and try to de-escalate this, though I suspect it will be absolutely impossible because, as you were pointing out, Maggie Chapman has now had her collar felt by whom? I've just come in from the funeral, so I haven't read that.
Well, it's the Faculty of Advocates, and I mean, and this is an unusual political intervention, saying that she's breached her duties under Scots law, because what she said, we say not in our name to the bigotry, prejudice and hatred that we see coming from the Supreme Court and from so many other institutions in our society. And the Faculty of Advocates have accused her of not upholding her duty to support the independence of the judiciary. And the Dean, Roddy Dunlop, and people who Roddy Dunlop is and his background, has written to the SNP MSP Karen Adam, asking her to consider Chapman's position as deputy convener of the Qualities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. And one of the things I find about it is the fact that I don't think you can, if you attack the independence of the judiciary from whatever position, it's equivalent to the Daily Mail saying over Brexit that the judges were the enemies of the people. And then you go down the line of what the Tories were saying about activist lawyers who were seeking to undermine our legislation and our asylum laws. And that's the problem that you get yourselves into when a legal decision is made. And I do not believe that the Supreme Court was acting out of prejudice or bias. They were asked to make a decision there. So Maggie's in a bit of trouble there. She's refused to apologise, and we'll wait to see what happens there. But I think the thing is, to me, we were talking about this before, and I'm so aware that everything you say for any small group on either side, just go, no, that's just not anything to do with it. But I mean, to me, the finest hour for Scots in the independence referendum was when we quietly agreed that the definition of a citizen of Scotland was someone who'd been here for 3 months. Mm-hmm. It didn't matter where you came from before that. It didn't matter if you're a Muslim or anything like that. It didn't matter. It just mattered. It was the closest we've ever been able to come to turning Riddoch, Tamsin's Bairns into some sort of legislative force. Now, I mean, that to me is the strongest thing about Scotland, is when we're able to act, and basically it's a bit of a come all ye. Now, I'll grant you, those days we don't make it. But that moment when there was huge support in Kenmure Street for the two Sikhs who were about to be deported by the Home Office, fantastic networking that stopped the van in its tracks, had thousands of people out on the streets to stop their neighbours being deported. That was describing a different kind of society and a different kind of outlook. Now, if it's at all humanly possible, I would like to keep that idea that we're not second guessing. We're not coming down like a ton of bricks on people, how they want to live their lives, where they come from, what the colour of skin is, what their religion is, or what their sexuality is, or any of these issues. We are saying if you're here, you choose to live here, you're in. And so that's, to me, the generalised outlook on citizenship that I would like this country to have. And anything that diminishes that, particularly in the eyes of the next generation, I think weakens us. Yes, I mean, I agree, but still within the framework, I still think that women's lived experience should be taken into account. And I do not believe that any woman who turns around and says she feels uncomfortable or threatened by the presence of someone in a changing room, etc., should be ignored. And I think there is a way to get round this. There is a way to actually, and as you say, to create situations that take the sting out of it, that have gender neutral areas if you're fine.
But this is the crux of the problem, isn't it? Because that's true, and anybody who's been raped may totally not want to be seeing a kind of trans woman doctor. Or there's lots of situations where you just want to be with with what you feel as people with whom you have the strongest identity in that moment, and that will be people that you feel are just coming from the same biological place as you, rightly or wrongly. That's how you'll feel.
Yes.
And if you're the one person, as it's been conjured up many times, the one lassie that's sitting in a changing room and suddenly a big hefty guy comes, what looks like right beside you, that could be that would be difficult to deal with. The thing is, those big hefty, what you think of guys, don't go away. Now, I appreciate, women have got to have the right to feel safe wherever they are. But these guys don't, or I'm calling them guys, I'm meaning this now in the sort of general American sense. Yeah. These people do not dematerialize. Once they're sort of, not able to go here and not able to go there, they don't just decide, oh, well, God, let's just go back to being, whatever we were beforehand. This is all too difficult. So we've got to come up with solutions, and we've got to be, I appreciate there's been some hard words said and bad behavior, and there's been graffiti in the middle of cities and all sorts of stuff going on here. But as far as I can see it, the bulk of people in any walk of life are simply trying to get on with it.
Yes.
And we could do with being as tolerant as possible.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, I may be a bit kumbaya, to use your favourite phrase, but why can't we all just get along? And that does require practical solutions. And I know that Sir Keir Starmer has now accepted the Supreme Court decision after humming and hawing about it. And we'll see what happens there from the UK government perspective. And I note that there are meetings going on across the Scottish government and between the Scottish and UK government to decide on policy thereafter. But the thing that we spoke about earlier within that framework, I mean, we've got the English local elections coming up on May the 1st, and also the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, which people may remember. That was Mike Amesbury, the pugilistic Labour MP, who resigned, and there's a by-election going on there. And More in Common, they just come out with their latest UK poll, and this is a multi-level regression and post-stratification methodology, an MRP poll. And we spoke about this before. I'll put a link up, folks, if you want to find out what MRP is about. But it is a more nuanced way of actually polling people that delves down into the potential ways they can vote. And there's more than 16,000 people across the UK. And More in Common discovered that, as you said, Reform would finish up with 180 seats, Labour and the Tories 165 each, Lib Dems 67, SNP 35, Independents 10, Plaid Cymru 5, and Greens 4. And as you said, the likelihood of that, the alliance that would arise from that would be a Reform Tory government led by Nigel Farage with 345, 326 needed. And Professor John Curtis said this is a sea change. I mean, because what you've actually got going on there is, I think the three major, this is an interesting one. They were referred to in the More in Common poll as the three main parties. Now, the three main parties, Labour, Tory, and Reform. There now are three main parties at a UK level. And it's
interesting to just note in that actually, despite that success in the rest of the United Kingdom, Reform don't seem to be on track to win any Westminster seats or any Holyrood constituency seats. So, I mean, they are projected to pick up on the list. But, there's a pretty big difference there then, where we'll end up with a Westminster that's basically led by Nigel Farage. I mean, just let your brain go round this, everybody. Which, in terms of a Westminster election, would be like a repeat of when, the Tories were removed from Scotland. Was that 1997? There was not a single Conservative seat left. On that occasion, the rest of the UK caught a grip and did much the same thing. So it sort of didn't seem quite as spectacular. But this time, we would have not a single Reform seat in Scotland, and they'd win in the UK. So, if that's where we're heading, it's kind of like, alarm bells should be sounding big style here, because that's just a horrific kind of possibility. This is the boat going down the Swanee, cutting off the anchors, just heading right over the edge of Niagara Falls. I don't know what analogy you need here to just get a bit of an alarm bell going.
Yeah, because what seems to be happening as well is that not only is uh, the Labour seem to be losing votes to what they call the progressive backlash. Now, wait for this one. The progressive backlash is to the Lib Dems and the Greens, which is good news for Reform, the Conservatives and the SNP. So it would appear, from their analysis, that what seems to be happening, that people who regard themselves on the left would actually switch to the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. Presumably Tories go to the Lib Dems and Labour go to the Greens in constituencies. But it's all an incredible knife edge. I mean, they reckon that 285 seats will be won by less than 1/3 of the vote, 233 seats be won by less than 5%, and just over 100 seats won by less than 2%. And a slight swing of 66 or 7% could actually mean a majority for either the Tories, Labour, or Reform on their own. So again, here we go again, folks. We've got district heating, and now it's the first past the vote system. Coming kicking in there, which could see us there. But it's unprecedented line. But if we thought that Boris Johnson led government was an absolute disaster, and then Liz Truss, think of a Nigel Farage government. I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about. And Kemi Badenoch, Deputy Prime Minister, and the way that they're heading there. But as you identified clearly, not north of the border, not in Scotland. This would not be happening. And it is that shift away and that drift away from what we perceive to be British values to very much English nationalism. And it's what's coming down the line. And at this point, it goes back to what you said earlier. If the SNP and the Yes movement cannot, I'm going to stick with the SNP, cannot make the most of this by all the things that you talked about, talking about results and talking about developing a clear path in terms of industrialization and green just transition in comparison to what is coming down the line in England. I mean, that's a monumental failure and a monumental lack of grasp of the nettle or the thistle on the road to independence, because it is what's happening. It is what's happening.
Yep. Yes, as usual, right. We don't disagree.
We don't disagree on that one. Well, there may be as we swing here though. It's we've got. I mean, it is a funny kind of thing for me to talk about this, Lesley. I mean, that I have not darkened the door of a Catholic church in terms of worship. I mean, I have been there for funerals and weddings, but I've not actually worshipped in a Catholic church until about 1980, where I just suddenly discovered I wasn't absolutely certain as to the existence of God. Therefore, going to mass and communion might not be the appropriate thing to do. But I always had a strong attachment to the worker priest kind of concept, and the priests that I knew in my local area and priests that I came across in Edinburgh when I was at university were very much on the left, if you like, in terms of pro-worker, pro-trade union, anti-poverty, and were actually involved in their communities. And that's the thing that seems to be coming out, I mean, about the death of Pope Francis, where there seems to be an outpouring of support for the man and recognition of his moral stances that he took. He was very much pro-trade union, anti-trickle-down economics, espoused social justice, and in particular over the past 18 months has been so strong on his opposition and vehement in his opposition to what Israel is carrying out in Gaza. And even on his final hours, when his last Urbi et Orbi statement, that's where he talked about Gaza and the humanitarian crisis, and urged a stop to the violence and the massacres, and clear that was going on in Gaza and on the West Bank, and called for an immediate ceasefire, and has done for the last 18 months, and called for the immediate recommencing of humanitarian aid and to stop the starvation that was going on. So an incredible moral stance there. And the stance that he took when he phoned up the Catholic Church in Gaza for the last 18 months, and did so right even on when he was dying, he phoned them up every night. However, there is a significant significant element that we've got to talk about when we talk about the Catholic Church and its stance. And I think I'll hand over to you to that, about the glaring injustice that still is at the heart of Catholic policy.
Well, yes. I mean, it honestly, it feels like there's I didn't realize 1.4 billion Catholics across the world. So this is larger than, I mean, almost, I don't know, is China? I don't know what we're talking about in terms of population, but it is an enormous influence then. And when you look at, he seems to have been a modest man who has made the right kind of tone, who's taken the right tone to a lot of things, and definitely seems to have been much more pious than into kind of empire building. Although it looks like such empires as he's built has been a pretty useful switch actually away from Europe and within the church, from the number of cardinals he's appointed who are from the developing world. My problem with this, listening to this, is that, the Catholic Church, I'm reading now from the BBC summary of this, because we had a wee conversation beforehand. Catholics are only permitted to use natural methods of birth control. And that's literally it. The Church does not condemn the pill or condoms in themselves. What is morally wrong is using such things with the intention of preventing conception. Now, that is being just cheerfully ignored by millions of Catholics, around the world, and particularly, in the West or North, however you want to say it. But having spent a lot of time, I ran a charity for 7 years based in Africa. It is very much observed within Africa, and actually was very responsible for the rapid transmission of AIDS, because the church disapproved of using condoms, even in the midst of the HIV epidemic. Mm-hmm. It also means that women have no ability to control their own fertility. And so girls who are being made to be sexual, from the minute they have just completed puberty, are basically cracking out any number of children with no ability to constrain that. And in terms of what that's doing for their countries, it's burdening those countries with the kind of demographics that the developed world had at a point when women were drudges. And I find this very hard, because obviously anyone who feels strongly as a Catholic is feeling grief at the moment. And it's very impactful. There's a lot of ritual around this, and there will be a lot of speculation about who comes next. I have to say there's some strange moments in that where, when some of the possible candidates were being discussed, someone who is only in his early 70s was being discounted because he's too young, because they don't want someone who's going to be there for too long before he dies, because this, the last pope resigned, but this was never heard of before. So, when you're sort of struggling to see the rationale that would make a 70-year-old too young to appoint, you've just got to question this, the kind of moral leadership that comes out of this. I wonder, there's at some point as well, the verb was used of the pontificate. And I thought, well, that is about it, isn't it? Pontificating. Because, we the rest of the world pretty much has accepted the, right for gay people to have loving marriages, which are acknowledged by the state and by some religions, but that's not possible. And there is the sort of the teaching on contraception is just being wildly ignored, except in areas where the slavish adherence to it is killing people, is killing women. So it's sort of, I don't know. And I'm sorry for anybody who feels strongly about this. This might feel like a bad moment to be bringing this up, and yet, as with everything in news, it brings things to the fore, which are most of the time very much in the back of your mind. I did actually look through all of this, because I thought maybe things have changed on this particular question of birth control, and came across a fascinating article by Catholics for Choice, which was talking about way back in the 1930s and then the 1960s, there was a papal commission set up to just look again at this question as to whether or not they basically got the line wrong on contraception. And there's a long, I'm still, still about the fifth page of this, but the commission went on and just jumped through various popes and eventually had the decision as to what it meant taken out of their hands. And a group of bishops decided that it was just, let's just dump that and push it to one side. So there's a lot of issues in there, and they are not going to be dealt with. Who knows who will come next? But, many of the folk in the know are saying that they regarded Pope Francis as too sort of, left is the wrong position, word in this context, but sort of they need somebody now who's more conservative. So that's not going to help the situation at all, which is kind of seems to me to be a shame. And saying that the Catholic Church moves in centuries, not years. Well, I don't know. It's a strange one. There's many people have converted to Catholicism, and within it, the role of ritual is very reassuring to people. I think in a world that sometimes seems to be just decimated by, virtual attrition, but yet its role across the developing world is what really worries me, and I suspect we're not going to really see much movement on that with whoever comes next.
No. And I mean, I do have to go back to the fact, and I've said this, that the Catholicism I grew up with was the Catholicism that developed my innate respect for individuals, and my socialism grew out of that. That was the way I grew up. But I always remember my mother being hauled up, because as a teacher at a secondary school, there was always we always had, it was religious education. It was registration class, and you theoretically got religious education at that point. And my mother was hauled up because she said, you're not teaching the Catholic Church's approach on contraception. To which my mother said to the group of women there, how many kids have you got? How many kids have you got? How many kids have you got? And she says, and don't you dare try and make me stand up in front of a group of working class girls and tell them to obey rules that I know you're not obeying. Because you've got one kid, you've got two kids. Where are the big families anymore? And that's the way that's always been got out of, Lesley, is there's always been ways out for people with money. There's been annulments, not divorces, and the folk in the Western world will cheerfully go about their business ignoring the stipulations on contraception. And they have done for decades now. But as you say, where it's absolutely needed, it's still adhered to. And the worry I have that there will be a reactionary pope who comes in and becomes even more stringent on matters, to do with social policy.
And you'd have to say, just, for completeness, the role of the Catholic Church, and there's not many churches covered in glory, but I think it would be fair to say the Catholic Church has had more difficulty with child abuse within the ranks.
Yes. Oh yeah.
And clearly the whole history of the Magdalene nurseries in Ireland, where unmarried women that became mothers had the children taken off them, and they were condemned to work essentially, as skivvies. Yeah. There's an awful lot of bad stuff there in the works. And yet I know that there'll be people who are very emotionally hit by all of this. So I don't know how to square all of it, except to say that the more you realize the clout that the church has within the world, so that it's brought the whole news agenda grinding to a halt, the more you realize what impact it would have if any of the work that's been done in the background to question just the question on family planning was brought to the fore and dealt with. And it's very unlikely to be. You'd have to say as well, though, that the sort of almost tragedy of the Pope dying, the day after he'd just done the sort of Easter Mass. Yeah, it's also a period where, everybody had Easter holidays, so there's not much news on the go. There's recess for the parliaments and so on. So it hit the news agenda with an absolute whack. But I think that should make people just consider what overall general impact there is on politics.
Yeah, but plus the fact, Lesley, it takes us back to the discussion that we're having earlier, that I'm not fence sitting on this, because I can see all the positive sides of Pope Francis, and again his devotion to the Franciscan ideal of poverty and service to the poor and the outcast. Yet I can still see the egregious outrages of what went on in terms of the things that you've raised and the matters that still exist within the Catholic Church and its own internal problems and its doctrines that need to be evaluated and examined. But this should be done, hopefully, in a loving manner, and should be worked out. And I think that's the whole way they're getting go back to other things we've talked about.
But we've still got this situation that people will say in a loving manner that women are not fit to be, office bearers within the Catholic Church, and that it's nothing personal, and that it's not meant to demean women. And you kind of go, well, what?
Well, it does,
So anyway, we're not going to get, but this is, you feel honestly. Because there's so many things as I'm listening to it, and I kind of think, this is really, and I can remember back when I was working in the BBC, this was the kind of dilemma you got stuck in pretty much any time there was a royal story or something like this, because there's so many things within it that presume a certain sort of worshipfulness and a suspension of disbelief, a suspension of critical faculties, and all of that as time goes on is a presumption that you can't make. I've got to say, just to completely annoy you, Pat, it's a bit like the sort of, standards seem to me to drop immediately for football commentary, because you go from what makes news and what makes a kind of cogent sentence, for anything else in life. And then you've got games of two halves and the boys really did us proud and, whatever else. Right?
It's shocking. Don't get me started. I don't mean, it gets about that whole thing about he just about kept it in. No, he kept it in. Just about kept it in when it went out. Football commentary. It's an easy way out for people who are absolutely unbelievably unsuccessful as football managers who seem to do this, just leap straight into that. But I want to get started. Because I nearly began this episode with turning around and saying I was shocked by the news yesterday, and I was struck to the core by the news that came through, and I couldn't believe it, which was the fact that Declan Gallagher, who's been outstanding at centre-half for Dundee United this season, hadn't had his contract renewed. But I thought, no, wait a minute there. That might just seem a bit odd to leading the death of Pope Francis. But, I'm going to finish with something here, because you popped in to see me, Lesley, and to be honest about it, I was taken aback, moved by the wee card that you gave me, and I'll let you say what it was about, because it was absolutely marvelous, and it was again very moving, and the wee card that we both got.
Yeah, it's from the Galloway Friends of MAP, which is now my brain's
Medical Aid for Palestinians.
Well done. Who were kind of thinking, well, they're sending little cards to journalists or broadcasters or anybody basically who they feel is constantly highlighting the plight of Palestine and Gaza, and I suppose it comes as a feeling of powerlessness, really, as to what you can do, and so many complaints constantly about BBC coverage in particular. But they thought, let's do this the other way around, and where there is anybody that is constantly highlighting Gaza, let's just encourage them. So they've sent me a beautiful handmade card, actually, which we'll just have to put a wee photo up at some point, because there's no way to describe it. But it looks like a combination of dove's wings encircling a whole bunch of little heart shapes, two of which are picked out in gold. And the message is keep on keeping on. So we will. Yeah.
And it finishes with, it is better to light a candle than to curse the darkness. We see your candle. Thank you.
And I totally agree. I hate to sort of, kind of bring this down to details about something that's happening in the next couple of days, which is not anywhere near as important as what's happening in Gaza. But just to say to anybody who's interested in this film about Denmark that is still doing the rounds, it was in Applecross, as I mentioned last week. And this week, it's showing in Canusi on Thursday and in Granton on Spey on Friday. And all the details about how to get, basically just turn up. But the tickets, information and where it's being held is all on lesleyriddoch.com/events. And I know there's still tickets in both those venues.
So if you haven't seen the movie, folks, get out and see it now. And generally on that note, we will see you next week, chum.